Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery, and today we're going to be taking a close look at the Urban EDC Supply company Nessie. Now this is a knife that I initially did not buy when it dropped because I typically go for, well, small, slim, lightweight knives, and this is just kind of the exact opposite. But two things happened that made me want to check one out. So when Urban EDC offered to loan one to me, I said yes quite eagerly. The first thing that happened is that a friend that kept saying that he really liked the story of the Nessmuk knife, and this, the Nessie, is a Nessmuk-inspired knife. I finally looked up that story, the whole backstory, history of it. What does Nessmuk even mean? And it's actually all really pretty cool. We'll talk all about that in just a second. The second thing that happened is, if you've watched my channel or other channels and talk about stuff from Urban EDC Supply Company, you know that they have something called the Ambassador Program. And what that means is that they gave me a link. And if you use that link to shop there, I'll make a small commission on the sales, which is a really cool way of helping support a channel. But from the very beginning, when they asked if I wanted to join, I said, that sounds nice, but I would be even more excited to be able to offer a discount code to people who are shopping. And they finally have worked out how to make that work with their pricing structure, but so far only with the Nessie. And so I wanted to be able to offer you guys a discount code like that, but I didn't want to do that without actually experiencing the knife and seeing if I thought it was something that people would actually be interested in. So let's talk about that backstory. Since this thing is called Nessie and it kind of looks like a whale, by the way, my whales are my favorite animal, so that's actually a fun little tie-in for me. But I always just kind of assumed that it was named after the Loch Ness Monster. It just kind of looks like that, but it turns out it has absolutely nothing to do with that. So Nessmuk is the pen name of a tiny little man named George Washington Sears. He's one of the forefathers of what would nowadays be called ultra lightweight camping, which he helped popularize through writings in Forest and Stream magazine and his book on the topic called Woodcraft. All of this was happening back in the late 1800s. Now, his focus on lightweight supplies was actually originally born out of necessity. The guy was tiny. He was only 5'3" and like just over 100 pounds. So he literally had to have an ultralight canoe bespoke made for him. But his camping techniques and the name Nessmuk itself also comes from Native American practices. Nessmuk was the name of the Narragansett man who taught him hunting, fishing, and camping. It's their word for the wood drake, or the male version of the wood duck. So they're the really colorful ones with the bright green heads and the vivid red eyes that make them look wildly possessed. Anyway, while lightweight supplies started as a necessity, it quickly flourished into a philosophy, and Nessmuk was advocating for a separate, slim, light fixed blade for slicing and a small hatchet for chopping, rather than trying to combine the two into the big, thick, and heavy outdoorsman knives you typically see. Now, the thing is, there's no formal description of what the quote-unquote Nessmuk knife, as it was come to known, actually was. All we have is a single drawing from the book he published and the general philosophies and qualities in a camp knife that he advocated for. So it's not a specific name brand knife, and it was almost certainly custom made for him. But if you just kind of look at the drawing, it was probably a 4 to 5 inch blade with an antler handle. That is, of course, if it ever actually existed in real life. It might just be a drawing. But the shape of the knife in that drawing is clearly meant to excel at slicing, and his writings indicate that it was likely intended for skinning and food prep. And that combination made it a popular enough knife that many, many people have now made their own version of the quote-unquote Nessmuk knife. And that brings us to what we have here today with the Nessie. This Nessmuk knife started as a custom knife from Chris Taylor of, and I absolutely love this brand name, Tailor Made Knives. That's just the single best name you could possibly have for a custom knife maker if your name is Taylor. Anyway, now he's made several different versions of the Nessie, as he calls it, from a fixed blade to a slip joint to a lockback, and now, as an exclusive partnership with Urban EDC Supply, a frame lock flipper. But he actually did make one frame lock flipper first, because when they came and talked with him about the idea of turning it into a flipper, he had already been working down that path and come up with how he thought this internal should work. So let's finally take a look at this knife and see how this translates to modern day, and especially coming from the camping world into the EDC world. So if we look at this blade, it is obviously the most iconic part and the thing that definitely makes this a quote-unquote Nessmuk knife. And what that is a large swooping knife, slightly leaf-shaped. It's got an upsweep right here. It's got a flat spot and a lot of belly, and it just, yeah, it kind of looks like a whale. This particular version has satin flats. Can we get that to work? Yeah, they're the hand satin type that go along the grind lines. I think that you can kind of focus on that. And then stonewash finish. And actually that provides a pretty cool juxtaposition that you don't see in a lot of knives. I think it looks pretty neat as a finish goes. Yeah, there, I think that angle shows you a little bit better. The stonewash itself is Riot's finish. This is I'm almost 100% confident Riot made knife. I would bet money on it, no questions asked, but technically speaking, they have an NDA and can't formally say who makes this knife, but this is Riot's version of a stonewash, and it's one of my favorites. It's a very shiny, still version of a stonewash. Yeah, it's got great reflectivity. You can see my face right there, but really nice, even pattern, and it hides wear really well. And I love to see that in any kind of knife that you actually plan on using. The blade stock on this is reasonably thick. This is 160 thousandths, but they have this really cool swedge along the top that makes it look thinner when you look down from above. The swedge is actually really neat. Most swedges are a straight line, and this one is actually curving down this entire way. You don't see that very often. That again just is lending to this reasonably unique aesthetic on this knife. It ends all the way up here, almost at the very tip. Part of what's going on there is that this dropping point and that swedge is thinning it out slightly, but you can see we still have a lot of beefiness all the way up here at the tip. So this is going to be a knife that you could do some real work with at the tip and not worry about, well, breaking it off at all. The thing is it being as thick as it is means it's not the best at piercing. This is a knife that's clearly designed for slicing. If you listen to the intro and didn't just skip right past it, you'll know that this is a slicing knife. And so what's cool here is that we have a pretty tall grind. What's interesting about this grind is that this is a good example of the fact that grinds aren't always just flat planes. And what I mean is that if it were just a flat plane like this that was in one dimension or one, well, a plane, it would be thinner down here than it is up here, because this is just going from 160 thousandths for a longer distance at this ramp, and it would come down to a thinner point. But the reality is that this slope is actually changing as we go. So it's coming down to a quite thin behind the edge for this type of knife, 19 thousandths back here, but staying 19 thousandths this entire way. In fact, it stays 19 thousandths all the way up to about here, and then doesn't drop down to about maybe 23, 24. And so what that means is that you're going from 19 thousandths to 160 thousandths over a much longer distance here than you are down here. And so we have a higher ramp back here and a shallower ramp down here. And so this is kind of similar to what you get on something like a compound grind that has a thick ramp at the back and a thinner ramp at the bottom. This part back here is going to be beefier, and this part's going to be thinner and slicier. And if you push this through cardboard, you do notice that this part wedges slightly more than it does up here. The end result, though, is that even with this shorter part back here, this entire thing is actually a much better slicer than you might imagine for that kind of blade stock. It was designed to be a slicing knife, and it really does perform that way. This is a tall enough grind and coming down to thin enough behind the edge that it does actually work pretty darn well for that. Now, the blade shape has some flat right there. And the thing is if you listen to the intro again, you'd know that this was originally designed, like the Nessmuk knife itself, not this, was originally designed to be a camping food prep knife. And so this flat part would imply that you could do some chopping, and you technically could, but only if you're working on the edge of a table. Because one thing that any kind of flipper tab knife is going to do is block your ability to get to the table on the back. This knife has a double whammy in that, though, because the handle itself curves downward, which means your hand would also be in the way, blocking your ability. But if you're working on the edge of a cutting board, you could use that for some chopping motion. The bigger thing, though, is that this is meant to be a slicing knife. We'll talk about the ergos of a pinch grip later and how good it is at that, but this is meant to be the kind of thing where you're making contact here and then slicing the entire way as you draw. You're able to do this rolling, rocking draw cut, and that allows you to do long, continuous slices across longer surfaces, which is actually quite good for food prep. If we come back into the top part here, we do have some jimping. This is the other thing. When we're in a pinch grip, your finger lands right here on this jimping, and it is pretty solid jimping. It's the kind that isn't rough, but it does lock you in enough. I would say it could be a little bit grippier. I think they probably did, yeah, you can see that this chamfer up here has the stone wash the same way so the satin flats were done afterward. And so the result is that the stone wash was done after the jimping was cut in two. And so while it works well enough, that stone wash is going to cut down the edges of these little jimps right here enough that it doesn't grip you as much as it could. And so I think it works well, but not absolutely perfect. But if you are going to be using this in a pinch grip, this is plenty enough for your forefinger to grip right here and do that kind of drawing cut as you go, especially if you're doing a rocking thing. Coming down here though, we'll look at the plunge grind. Okay, so the plunge grind is the thing that takes it from the full thickness of the edge the full thickness of the blade stock to the thinness behind the edge. And you can see that it's a pretty aggressive plunge grind. It ends right about there. Now this isn't a deep sharpening choil, but that does give you this entire room here to sharpen before you start hitting a smile, and that's really, really nice to see. I always worry on knives like this, especially ones coming from Riot. They tend to make their plunges a little bit more drawn out and not hit till right there, so it's really cool to see that. If we look at the edge itself, I believe this one came to me used. I'm pretty sure this is something that another reviewer checked out. The edge is actually in pretty darn good shape still. It was still like very easily shaving sharp when I got it, and the edge is very consistent the entire way. That's it. They're able to do that in part because of the fact, like I said, that they keep the same thinness behind the edge the entire way. But they even did a good job doing it all the way up to this tip. Let me see if I can get a better view over here. Like this doesn't become much bigger out here, despite the fact that there's a good beefiness right there. So they did a really nice job on that. If we move back to the handle, this is where, at least for my particular hands, I have medium-sized glove hands, which is slightly smaller than average. But at least for my particular hands, this is where I start having some ergonomic issues. I think the size of my hands really is the main culprit here, because this is just a slightly bigger knife for me. But there are a couple of things that I'll point out that I think they could have just not done or done differently that would help with the ergonomics. For me, this immediately feels natural in this kind of slightly canted forward saber grip. And what's going on here is my fingers is resting right against this spot right there, and the entire knife, this curved part back here, is resting in my hand, and this just feels good. This is what immediately it feels like the way it's meant to be held in my hand. The thing is though, is now I'm back here and I'm not touching that jimping. And so if I were to cant this upward so that it's now in what would be like a hammer grip where my thumb is now on that jimping, this is where I start running into problems, because this spot down here is in this like hook down. It's in slightly a weird spot. The space on either side is big enough that I assume you're supposed to fit two fingers, but it's not evenly placed between the two, which means there's less room back here than up here. And so in this grip, that's fine because the entire thing is at an angle. But in this grip, it's pretty easy for me to grab this in a way that puts my finger right on top of this point. Now, your hand might be just more spread out than mine, but then you might start getting cramped back here. This point, though, it corresponds with where the lock bar cutout relief is. And what that means is that this is the thinnest part of the handle by far, and it's just right that little point right there. So all of the weight right here is being pushed on this very, very thin spot. Now this is a Riot knife, and so they always do a very good job of doing little chamfers on all of these corners. So this isn't sharp, it's just pretty darn jabby, and I feel it consistently. Again, it could just be the nature of the size of my hand, but I don't like when any kind of grip can put me on something that just is physically unpleasant to poke into. If your hand is bigger, and if it ends up squeezing down here, we also run into another jabby thing right here. This back corner is quite pointy. Again, they do good jobs of chamfering things, but it's a sharp jab. Now, I don't have big enough hands for that to be a thing, but if I try and stretch out and emulate what it would be like to press into that, yeah, that kind of sucks. I think this feels really, really comfortable, and that doesn't. And so what this is telling me that if this is a knife that does work for your hands, it's probably gonna feel great. But if it doesn't, there's enough little sharp jabs that are making it bad. So this is also where then the clip comes in, because in this grip where my hand feels good with the fingers, the clip rubs me in a hot spot. In this grip where my fingers feel bad, The clip does not. What this talks about, what I'm going at, is where the clip lands on your hand. So most people's hands have a groove right here that extends right up to here, and they have like a thicker, bulkier pad of muscle right there. And so if a clip lands over here, generally speaking, it's going to feel fine. You're not going to really feel it. If it lands past that line right here, it's going to be jabbing you the entire way. And in this grip, that's where this is landing. Right there. Looks great. But in that grip, and one that immediately feels normal and natural, it's right there and it's jabbing me every single time. Again, this is just a thing that's going to be for your hands, might not. My hands, it does. And so for me, this is definitely a hot spot, this little corner right here. Now they could have addressed this, again, for my hands, might have messed it up for other people, but I think in general it made it better by just moving this back, because the further you move the tip of this back, the less likely it is going to poke anybody. And they actually, I think, could have done that because they have this really nice chamfer at the back. And so normally you don't want a tall clip sticking out right out the back because it's going to be the only thing that you're touching back here is going to dig into the back of your hand. As is, though, if I try and emulate what that would be like, yeah, that chamfer means that it doesn't hurt at all. Where it is sitting forward like this means that I definitely don't feel that clip at all. It feels great back there, but I keep getting distracted by being right there. Now, the other thing about moving this back is it would also address just how shallow the carry is on this. It's a good, that's like a full inch. And it is such a wide knife back here that this is another part that, like, some people don't care at all about deep carry. Part of me wanting thin, light, discreet knives is I will like a deep carry clip. And so the other thing going on here is that for a clip that is a single screw, this is actually a reasonably long pad. Normally they're a little bit shorter than that, or they'll have 2 screws. And so everything about this, I feel like they could have just pulled this slightly up, moved the entire thing slightly back, and gotten down to being something more like that. But as is, it's right about there. The clip itself, though, is actually pretty darn good. It's a relatively standard-y clip. There's not a whole lot going on here, but it has a really nice ramp in both the push and the pull direction, so it's not going to snag in your pants either way. It's got good retention, but enough flex. I actually really liked the clip in and out of pocket. This one, at least, is a tappy clip. What that means is that there's a very slight gap right there, but you could take this apart and bend this down just slightly. And if this were my personal life, I would do that because tappy clips drive me a little bit insane. But the clip, in terms of functionality, works pretty darn well. Now, I said that the most intuitive grip for me initially is this kind of style saber grip with it slightly canted forward. It just immediately fits my hand everywhere except for that pocket clip. But the most intuitive grip for me is this. This works so dang well for this pinch grip. Even with my hand size, this works fantastically. What's happening here is my middle finger is resting against this little hook and my back 2 fingers are resting against that. This swell right here, this curve at the back, is going right into this curve of my hand, and then that's where my finger is right on that jimping. And this feels fantastic in a pinch grip. If you then choke up further and do that grip like I was talking about, that also feels fantastic. And you can put your finger along the blade, you can put your thumb right there, and this is still wide enough that you can get all the way up to there, even with my size hand, and this just feels, yeah, very locked in. As far as other stuff with this handle, like I said, this is a Riot knife, and they do a really, really nice job of just chamfering everything. Everything is just good. They always do these delightful little edges everywhere. That mean nothing is sharp. Things can be jabby, but nothing is sharp. And one of the things that I really liked is that the chamfer that runs around this entire thing extends at the front. This is a significantly bigger, longer, and more sloped chamfer right here than it is back here. And it's like that on both sides. And the reason why I really like that at the front of a knife is that because that allows you to hold it in this kind of modified pinch grip, which is how you hold a chef's knife. This is how most professional chefs and home chefs will hold a chef's knife with this kind of pinch. And since this is supposed to be kind of like a food preppy knife, that makes even more sense, especially if you're doing any kind of rocking like that. And the reason why that works in a chef's knife pinch grip is because of the fact that you can nestle down on these little grooves right there. It gives you the perfect spot to put your thumb. And I love that. I love to see that. I was trying to explain to Kevin, aka Lefty EDC, why I didn't like the front top part of his Stout knife. Like, what was the deal with this? And this is exactly what I'm trying to say. It would feel nicer if it sloped downward like you see right here on this knife. That feels great up there. The As far as lock bar access right here, we've got this small scallop. I think it could have made this even bigger, especially because this isn't a super big gap. I don't have any trouble getting in here at all, but I do get the impression consistently that this knife isn't quite made for people with my size hands. And so if you have really big hands, you might have a little bit of difficulty. There is a chamfer on the other side. It's hard to see, but overall, I think it's the kind of thing where I don't have any trouble whatsoever, but I could see potentially some people. I don't think that's much of a concern. As far as what's going on inside, we've got, well, this is the Micarta version. There's also a green Micarta version and a G10 version, and all of those are going to have the same kind of functionality of here. And if my gut says that the Thai one will too, because if I look at how like the F5.5 is constructed and stuff like that, even the Thai versions, this is actually a scale with a full Thai liner. If we look at what's going on, bounce some light up in there, we can see that there is a full Thai liner that's nested this entire way. It's very tightly nested, and that means that this side is very strong and sturdy and stable. There's absolutely no flex in this whatsoever. If we look at the other side, you can see that they actually did quite a bit of weight relief. It's not absurdly weight relieved, but how much weight relief can you even put on a lock bar side? They actually did something that very few people do, and they put weight relief on the lock bar itself. You almost never see that, but that's really cool. Part of what that's doing is trying to get the weight down. And this particular version is 4.85 ounces. And it's the kind of thing where that is heavier than almost any knife that I actually own and carry. But it's so big enough in this dimension and everything that this doesn't feel heavy. I was actually expecting this to be much, much heavier feeling. The full Thai version is almost a full ounce more, I think, maybe a little less. I think it's at least 5.5 ounces. I think it's 5.8. And so that one might actually feel too heavy for me. But honestly, when I picked this up, I was like, oh, that's not bad. That's not bad at all. I thought this was going to be much heavier from the way people talked about it. It is heavy in the sense that it has like heft to it, but it's not the kind of thing that feels heavy. This is only a 3.375 inch blade, so 4.8 ounces on a 3.375. That's definitely significantly over the ounce and inch mark, but you don't really expect this to hit that ounce and inch mark, especially with a handle this thick. This handle is 0.586 inches, and that's pretty hefty. That's reasonably thick right here. But again, this is the kind of knife that you expect it to be big and fill your hand, and it does fill your hand delightfully, and it distributes that weight in a way that actually feels really nicely balanced. As far as the actual balance point itself, it is really nicely balanced. The balance point is right about where your pointer finger is, and that's right where you want the knife to be. Now, the fact that the distribution of the weight on the blade does put the weight kind of towards the tip, you do kind of feel that swinging aspect, but it's not actually that bad. The bigger thing I would say is just that the flipper tab here is keeping you back behind here, and so you've got a fair distance until you get to the edge, and so I do sometimes feel like I'm not very close to the edge, and that sense of close to the edge is kind of hard to describe until you've tried cutting with things and you know what that means, because there's just this sense of like a spatial awareness of when you're cutting, of whether or not you're going to be sliding off the edge of something or something like that. So I find that the balance on this knife is actually really pretty impressive. And it's honestly significantly less heavy feeling than I was expecting. It's actually not all that heavy. The other thing we're going to see inside right here, it's going to be hard to show that. I'm sure it's not going to focus, but this is cool. One of the things that Urban EDC Supply Company tends to do with their knives when they do custom collaborations like this with knife makers is they do a combination logo if they can. You'll see on the F5.5s that it's Vox's bomb logo mixed with Urban EDC's clock logo, and they love to do it, especially if they have a like a round logo tie-in. And so this is TaylorMade Knives Dragon round logo, and if you probably can't see it, at the very top is the little clocky aspect that makes this look like a stopwatch or whatever exactly it is. I think it's a compass, maybe. Yeah, it's probably a compass. That's probably what it really is. And it's just fun to see those kind of little internal things like that. The other thing I would say is that there is this backspacer along the back, and it's cool to me to see it be a contrast color like that. You don't really see browns and blacks together, but that adds to this just kind of general rustic look of this. It's like dark textures like you would see. I will say that I think this means that if you were to drop it in the woods, it'd be very hard to find, but I think it looks really nice together like that. And it is a full backspacer that comes all the way down to the bottom right there. The other thing I'm going to say about this is that this is like my least favorite kind of lanyard hole. This is a lanyard hole that goes all the way through, and you can see from inside there that it means that there's like this entire back portion of the handle is not being used by the blade. And so partly what's going on there is it's reminding me that this blade could sit in even deeper. And since this is a reasonably big knife in this dimension, I think like any kind of time I'm reminded that this could come in further, I'm like, ugh. But the bigger thing is just, I hate lanyard holes like this because they are, I think, just kind of lazy. I think it would look better if it did the kind of thing where there's a post back here and a cutout inside the backspacer that makes it hidden but allows you to loop around. This just is a hole that's been added onto the back of the knife. And sure, it echoes the round spots there, but I think it would look meaningfully better if it just didn't have that. Coming forward to this flipper tab, the things I think would look meaningfully better if it just didn't have this flipper tab. I hate the look of this flipper tab. It just looks weird to me, and from an aesthetics perspective alone, it just looks weird. But from a functional perspective, this is where, come on, why? Why? Don't do this. This is breaking a lot of flipper tab rules. One of the things it's doing is this putting significantly behind the pivot. And what that means is that you don't have much distance at all until this is now hidden behind the scales when you're trying to open it. You have this very small distance of travel for you to be able to apply pressure. The other thing that they're doing is they're leaning it far back. You should lean flipper tabs forward, if anything. And I know the more forward you lean, the more possibility you have of hooking on like a corner that makes it feel pokey or something. But the more front and forward leaning a flipper tab is, the more traction you're going to get, the more leverage you're going to get, and the more time you're going to be able to apply pressure to that in order to get a good solid thwack. And so the result of this is that I think it looks weird, and I think it does not perform well. It doesn't have any kind of jimping at all, so what you're relying on entirely is this slight hook up shape. And that does, it does work, but this is not hard at all to fail, because like it doesn't let you push for very long. It doesn't let you make contact for very long. And because there's no jimping, you do start kind of sliding off of it as you pull back. And so again, you can certainly open this knife without, if you're trying to, you can do it. But it's also the kind of thing where you can really easily fail it. As far as the rest of this goes, I always think that the front of this looks odd to me. You just don't normally see them swell back in like this. And since this is definitely not a finger choil, even with my smaller hands, I would never put my finger there. It seems to me that you could just extend this part downward and it would look less weird. And so everything about this flipper tab is just, I've seen plenty of people actually take these knives and do flipper deletes on them and do something like a thumb stud right there or a hole right there. We'll talk about that in the future because they're actually doing that themselves on a future iteration of this. But I've seen those mods and it immediately makes the knife look like instantly better to me. So apologies to Chris for insulting your flipper tab design here, but it really does just work a lot better without the flipper tab. Let's get into that action for just a second. This is, the opening action is not a good thwack from a geometry of flipper tab, pressure and everything like that, but you do get a good thwack, especially if you get a powerful one, based on just the sheer amount of weight of this blade that comes swinging up. It clicks into place in a really nice way. And so when you get it open, it does feel like a good thunk. And that's one of the things that's just kind of fun and satisfying about big, thick knives like this. As far as closing, it also means that happens because, if you're going to put a big, thick blade on a knife, that just means that gravity has plenty of time to pull that right down. Oof. And it does have a very satisfying, clunk into place down here. I would say that this is it's not a fun knife to fidget with in the sense that, I don't know. I find this flipper tab also starts to hurt my finger after not too long, but the sensation of it closing is a dream. That I get it. I get why people like that. It's just fun. The other thing is that the close here. So this is how far you have to close it to get to that detent ball. So you have to move it past this much in order to be up on the detent ball and have it fall close. This is 16 degrees. Which is fine. It's not bad. It's not exceptional, but like average is somewhere between 18 and 20. And so this is a little bit better than average. But the thing about that, this always matters the most on knives with flipper tabs. And so this is one of the times where the fact that this leans back as much as it does actually helps, because that leaning back here means it's leaning forward here. And so you actually can let this fall to your thumb and stop on the flipper tab, and you were up on that blade. So I'm up on that detent ball. So if you do the fall to the nail, you're already on it, and you can take your thumb out and it will just close. And what I like also is that this is not that like the swing home, gonna chop your finger off kind of guillotine. It's more of like a little bit slower, slightly more controlled fall home. So it's actually quite fun and easy to make it fall to your nail, pull your thumb out, and you have plenty of time to get your thumb out, and then it just falls. And so the closing action on this is probably my favorite part of the entire knife. The other thing about action is that you can, because there is a slight amount of grind exposed down there, you can middle finger flick this knife. What I'm doing is putting my finger down here along this grind, pressing it against the blade and flicking up and out. And that works on almost any knife where you can press along the blade, the grind itself, because the grind means that you're able to push on a ramp. You're not pushing on a flat spot. It helps especially that this is a stonewash, because that means you have a slightly traction-y surface. And so it doesn't work on every knife, but especially if you can get against that grind and can get against a finish like a stonewash, you can usually fling it out like that. And so that does make it a little bit more fun, but you can see how weirdly I'm having to scoop my hand down here in order to be able to reach this bottom part down here. I've seen some people actually be able to flick off of that little spot right there. And I personally, I mean, you can see I just kind of almost got it. I almost got it. It's the kind of thing where I might be able to get that to work, but I can't do it reliably. And so that's not gonna be like a way that I actually normally fidget with this knife. Now, the other thing I wanna talk about this is just like how are you supposed to use this? Because this was set up as a camping knife originally, not necessarily this Nessie, but the Nessmuk knife is a camping knife. It's like an outdoor camping wilderness knife. And it was designed, again, to be slicing, not chopping. The whole point of Nessmuk's like holy trinity of saying that you should carry a small folding knife, a slicey fixed blade knife, and then a hatchet is that you shouldn't be doing chopping motions with a knife if you can be using something that's a tool better suited for chopping. And so this is not meant to be a chopping knife. This is meant to be a slicing knife. But could you chop with it? This feels like a big honkin' chunky knife, and that makes people want to go out there and go whacking at stuff. And the reality is, I don't think you should do that. Not only is it not meant for that in general style, it's not meant for that for the fact that it's got a 19 thousandths behind the edge, so there's not like a big thick edge that's meant to be chopping into stuff. But the other thing is just that if you look at how this knife is actually made, this is a completely standard stop pin. It's not a small stop pin, but this is the exact same 3mm stop pin you'll find on a bunch of other knives, including small, tiny, thin knives. This is a Richard Rogers OEM Slim. This is an extremely thin, lightweight knife. That's the exact same 3mm stop pin. It's a common normal one. So the result is that this does not have a larger than average big beefy stop pin you'll find on beater knives like something like an XM18 from Hinderer. The other thing I really want to point out here is the placement of the stop pin. And this is something that bothers me also about the Giant Mouse, totally blanking on the name of that knife, but the big bulky Giant Mouse that everyone says is an outdoor beater knife. The placement of the stop pin is really low down, tight up against the pivot. It's also slightly in front of the pivot. You can see that what's going on here is that the blade wraps up around it. So there's a channel cutout right there that is going in. And so what that means is there's not a whole lot of metal down here around this. Like this cutout means that there's very little metal actually around the pivot right there. And so it's a fracture risk right there. But the other thing is that if you look at the way that that's touching the stop pin, that means that the pressure on the stop pin is going to be slightly up and slightly back. So it's going to be in kind of in this direction. And so that's all well and good. The up and back part is fine because it means that it'd be going into this thicker part of the titanium up here. I've seen some knives have it where the pressure is going to be down at this point, which is a very, very thin spot. But the bigger thing is that what's going to happen if you hit this to the point where you fracture something right here, you're talking about the sheer strength of this 3mm pin. And it takes a lot of force to shear something like that, or to crack the titanium liner or frame around that. But there is only a certain amount of force that can take, right? So that's going to be the same amount of shear force no matter where you put it. But where you put it is going to determine the torque. I always talk about this in my videos. When people talk about knives, they almost always talk about it in terms of force, but all of this is rotational, so it should be in terms of torque. So torque is force times lever arm distance. So if this pin can withstand a certain amount of shear force, if you have it right here, that shear force is going to provide a certain amount of maximum torque, prevent the blade from going that way. If you put it right here, you're going to have literally twice the amount of torque that you can withstand, even though it's the force that it can stand is the same. And so on a knife that you do want to be able to beat against, what you would want to look for is a big, thick stop pin that is located as far away from the pivot as they can comfortably put it. And so if you look at something like a Hinderer, it's a big, thick stop pin, and it's all the way up here, not right there. So my final thoughts on this knife as is that it's actually, it makes a lot more sense than I anticipated it to. I was really expecting it to be just kind of a little bit too ridiculous in some way. It's a knife that, you know, has a very dramatic shape to it, and that can kind of make it feel like a caricature to a degree. And so I just kind of expected, with the thickness and the general shape and the weight that people talked about, that this was going to be a knife that when I got in hand, I was like, yeah, okay. But no, the reality is once that I actually started holding this, and once I actually started trying slicing with this makes a lot more sense. I think that I have issues ergonomically with that because of my specific hand shape. This size and shape isn't right quite for me with my medium-sized glove hands. But I think if this did fit your hands correctly, I can see why people would actually really, really like it. I also can see why people delete the flipper tab and add in a different opening mechanism. And the thing is, they're actually planning on doing that themselves in a future iteration. They're talking about doing two different things that would solve both of my problems with this knife. One is they're talking about doing a thumb stud version of this knife, and they're also talking about doing a mini version of this knife. And I'm not sure if those are going to be the same thing. Like if they follow up with a mini thumb stud, that would solve both for me. If they do those as separate concepts, I'm not sure. But I love to see that they are doing that kind of iterative thing, because part of it is they've heard response on this flipper tab, and that's part of the reason why they're moving in a direction like that. So I love hearing that they're also listening to customer feedback like that. I think if they made a smaller version of this where none of these points met my hand in the wrong way, I still would be a little bit annoyed that they did something like put this point here, but if it never poked me, then I wouldn't care that it was there. And since it is such a nice slicing blade, I could see wanting to actually use it as an EDC knife. I don't know if I would use this as a camp knife necessarily, just because for camp knives, I typically have, I have a couple of fixed blades now, which is interesting, but I think you actually really could, just as long as you recognize that from the get-go, this always was meant to be a slicing camp knife. Despite the fact having 0.16 blade stock, this just isn't the kind of thing you're supposed to be whacking at stuff on. It never really was meant to be that. It was always meant to be a slicey camp knife. And for that, I think it would actually work pretty well. The weight to it, though, these days, the weight of this probably counts as ultralight camping back in the 1800s. But these days, you can get very lightweight things. And so there are folks who would count the Bug Out, for example, as an ultralight camping knife. It's all going to be a matter of perspective for what you want. I think this is the kind of thing that if it fits you, you might end up really liking it. And that's where the other thing comes in, is that this is now, they're offering discounts. And now that I see it and I can understand that people would want it, I am confident there are people who will want this. I already know some friends who absolutely love theirs. And so if you are planning on getting one of these and you haven't gotten one yet, you can save money. Now, the deal is they have different handle patterns, and they initially released a green G10, like olive drab green jean, OD green, a jade G10, and a full tie. They later released this one as a separate drop, and the consequence of that is that these are listed as separate items, and I think that is very confusing to people, because if you get onto the one, you see other options, including Micarta, and it just looks like this doesn't exist. And so I find that a little bit frustrating. I think I get that it's a side effect of how they're put on the site, but I think they could just merge them at this point. But it also means that they're doing slightly different discounts on these. If you've seen any of these discount codes pop up at other channels before, they're doing a 5% discount on the original dropped items, the JG10, the OD green, and the tie, and they're doing a 10% discount only on this brown one. And again, I personally find that kind of frustrating. I find it kind of annoying that there's differences between the two, but I understand from their perspective, they're probably trying to push one or another, or maybe they're trying to incentivize one or another. But the thing that also kind of bugs me, and but I'm just getting really nitpicky here, the way that they're implementing this is codes that correspond to the amount. So if you want to do this, I haven't actually said it out loud yet, if you want to get the other color schemes, those you can use the code nerdery, like my channel name, Knife Nerdery, nerdery5, and for this one you can use nerdery 10. That, I love that they're doing it, but I also kind of, that implementation kind of bugs me a little bit too, because then you have to think about which code corresponds to which knife and make sure you're typing the right one. I would have preferred if they had just made like nerd or nerdery and it just corresponded to the correct discount depending on which one you had in your cart, but whatever. I'm nitpicking here. I love at the end of the day to see that Urban EDC is finally implementing discounts for the customers. That is such a cool thing to do. And that's something that I've been asking, and I know a lot of other YouTubers have been asking for from the very beginning. And so I love to finally see that. So if you think this would fit you, and if you think that this is something that's up your alley, by all means, I get it. I get why you would like it. It's so freaking fun to have it do that. And if you want to save some money, you can use Nerdery 5 for the other color schemes or Nerdery 10 for this one. Also, at one point, they did drop a full tie Sagaiha wave pattern one. That's just no longer in stock anymore, so there's no discount on that. But if you're into that, and especially if you're leaning into the kind of more Loch Ness monster-y version of this, I can see why you might want to hunt that down on the secondary. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Thank you again to Urban EDC Supply for letting me check this out. If you do end up getting one of these, especially if you end up using that my discount code, let me know, and let me know what you think of this thing. I think that'd be great. I think those discount codes are only valid through the end of the month. I'm not really sure how long they're going to stay up, but I hope. Well, just try them if you go. Worst case scenario is you end up trying to get one of those little spinner discount codes that they offer, or maybe you can sign up for the mailing list or something like that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.